The title of this lecture is The New Homiletic: Induction, Plot, and Narrative. The new homiletic is getting old. I mean that literally. It came to prominence in the 1970s and 80s, so it is really no longer new to homiletic theory. But the name captured such an important shift in North American mainline homiletics that it might be worth keeping a bit longer. The new homiletic was named after the new hermeneutic, which was advanced by Gerhard Ebeling and Ernst Fuchs. Grounded in the philosophy of Martin Heidegger, the new hermeneutic accentuated a performative conception of language, arguing that human communication facilitates word events. Likewise, the new homiletic focuses on creating a word event in which listeners experience and encounter God, rather than just passively receiving homiletical information. In order to understand the new homiletic, we must understand not only the new hermeneutic for which it was named, but also the old homiletic that it sought to replace. In 1870, John Broadus published a book entitled A Treatise on the Preparation and Delivery of Sermons. Broadus promoted a thoroughly rhetorical view of preaching. He even defined homiletics as the adaptation of rhetoric to the particular ends and demands of Christian preaching. For Broadus, preaching was a rational exercise intended to persuade listeners. The sermon was to move deductively from a general principle toward its specific meaning and applications. In Broadus's language, the sermon was to foreground its subject or its proposition in clear correlation to a biblical text. He recommended that the subject be announced during the introduction. Then the sermon was to engage in explanation, application, argumentation, and illustration in order to enlighten listeners and convince them of biblical truth. The sermon was to end by making specific applications of the message to the lives of the listeners. This type of preaching often took the shape of what is now called a point form sermon, a series of propositions with subpoints for each, all of which supported the main thesis or proposition of the message. The sermon was represented in a deductive outline, and this was the predominant homiletic approach in North American mainline pulpits for the first half of the 20th century. But in 1958, Grady Davis published a book entitled Design for Preaching. Davis argued that sermons assume the natural form of the idea that is being preached, and so each sermon has a unique intrinsic design. Davis shifted the conversation from a rational point form model to a more aesthetic and artistic vision of the sermon. He thus paved the way for the new homiletic. In 1971, Fred Craddock published a book entitled As One Without Authority, a watershed work in homiletics. Troubled by the dreary state of logical point form sermons at the time, Craddock championed inductive movement in sermons, which progresses from the particulars of experience to a general truth or conclusion, instead of the more traditional deductive movement, which progresses from a general truth or conclusion to the particulars of application. In place of monological preaching, said Craddock, the speaker-hearer relationship demands a more dialogical method, which will affect transformation in individuals and societal structures. Craddock grounded his proposed shift in both philosophy of language and biblical studies. Philosophically speaking, instead of Wittgenstein's scientific view of language, which is based on the principle of verification, Craddock adopted Heidegger's primitive and poetic understanding of language, that words lay hold of and express life itself. Biblically speaking, Craddock took the parables of Jesus as his example. In parables, he said, it is the method that affects the experience. The method is the message. So it is with all preaching. How one preaches is to a large extent what one preaches. Craddock believed a new mode of preaching akin to parables, narratives, poems, and songs would restore power to a languishing pulpit. The congregation's experience of the sermon was crucial in Craddock's mind. He suggested that the sermon should evoke an experience of the gospel rather than just imparting knowledge of the gospel. He advocated for preachers to identify with the congregation, to employ concrete language, and to use the tools of anticipation and suspense in order to create and sustain the interest of listeners. Craddock's homiletic approach elevated images over concepts. He viewed the preacher as an artist who replaces the image-laden galleries in the listener's mind with new images. Images, in this view, are essential, not merely illustrative. According to Craddock, preachers must have an empathetic imagination, which means, first, having the wisdom and grace to receive the images of life about us, and then second, the freedom and confidence to reflect these with appropriate expressions. In the pulpit, said Craddock, the preacher is to recreate with the congregation the inductive experience of coming to an understanding of the message of the text. In other words, the inductive preacher takes the exegetical process into the pulpit, not just the exegetical product. The sermon is designed as a trip toward the conclusion that the pastor reached in the study. However, the sermon preferably will stop short of stating its conclusion, just as Jesus' parables stop short, and thereby allow each congregant to draw his or her own conclusion. This allows listeners to participate in the making and the meaning of the sermon. Another landmark work associated with the new homiletic was Eugene Lowry's book entitled The Homiletical Plot. Published in 1980, this work proposed that the sermon be conceived as a narrative rather than a rational argument. Lowry suggested that the best preaching feels like a story and moves like a plot. A sermon, he said, is not a doctrinal lecture. It is an event in time, a narrative art form more akin to a play or novel in shape. Hence, we are not engineering scientists. We are narrative artists by professional function. Lowry explicitly followed Grady Davis in viewing the design of the sermon in terms of its movement rather than its outline. Like Craddock, Lowry highlighted the parable, especially the parable of the prodigal son, as the exemplary sermon form. Central to Lowry's vision of the sermon as a narrative plot is the element of a discrepancy, an ambiguity to be worked through, something that is up in the air during the sermon. Lowry says the sermon begins with an itch, some predicament of the human condition, and moves toward a scratch, a solution born of the gospel. More specifically, he proposes 5 sequential stages to the homiletical plot. Number 1, upsetting the equilibrium. Number 2, analyzing the discrepancy. Number 3, disclosing the clue to resolution. Number 4, experiencing the gospel. And number 5, anticipating the consequences or anticipating the future. In Lowry's plot form sermon, timing and transitions are both absolutely critical. The idea is not to preach a story, but rather to design every sermon as a narrative plot that moves from conflict toward resolution, from human predicament toward gospel response, from itch to scratch. Lowry's plot begins inductively, working from a problem of the human condition toward the gospel. Yet it ends deductively by proclaiming the gospel solution to the problem. The key turning point in the midst of the sermon was what Lowry calls a reversal or a sudden shift when the gospel turns life upside down. Lowry and Craddock agree on several things. They agree that the parable is an exemplary homiletic form for preachers. They agree that the preacher's process of studying and grappling with the biblical text should not be left behind on Sunday morning, but rather should be represented in the sermon itself. They agree on the use of suspense and the effort to facilitate a moment of discovery and an experience of the gospel for listeners. However, Craddock emphasizes inductive movement from the particulars of human experience to the general truth of the gospel, whereas Lowry emphasizes narrative movement from the predicament of human experience to the proclamation of the gospel. There is a difference. Lowry hopes that his both-and approach represents a viable middle way that honors liberalism's focus on human experience and neo-orthodoxy's focus on the Word of God. While Craddock and Lowry are the two principal figures in the development of the new homiletic, two other books published in 1980 contributed to this movement as well. And they also contributed to a movement that came to be called narrative preaching. First, in his book entitled Telling the Story, Variety and Imagination in Preaching, Robert A. Jensen encouraged preachers to preach story sermons. This means that the whole sermon is a story told from start to finish. A story sermon can be preached in the third person with the preacher as narrator, or in the first person with the preacher assuming the voice of a character, in the biblical text, for instance. Second, in their book entitled Preaching the Story, Edmund Steamley, Morris Niedenthal, and Charles Rice suggest that the preacher is primarily a storyteller. They portray the Christian faith in terms of hearing, telling, and living a story. And they define preaching as shared story. In this model, the preacher is a storyteller who relates the story of the gospel to the story of life and the story of the listeners' lives. The new homiletic has shaped much homiletic theory and many sermons since the 1980s. The abiding influence of Craddock and Lowry is evident in that both of their books were published in revised editions in 2001. Furthermore, Craddock in particular remains a preaching hero to many pastors today. Now that we have a basic grasp of the new homiletic, it is important to understand the critiques that have been leveled against it. I will briefly mention 4 homileticians whose work critiques the new homiletic in one way or another. First, John McClure is concerned that the new homiletic encourages preachers to identify with the congregation through appeals to common human experience, including Craddock's concept of the empathetic imagination. According to McClure, this approach assumes that preachers and congregants experience the world in similar ways, and it functions to make the preacher's experience normative. Therefore, the preacher who speaks as one without authority may actually be implying that his or her own experience is the standard by which all Christian experience should be measured. Instead, McClure wants preachers to become aware of the infinite and irreducible difference between their own experiences, the forms of experience assumed by the canon, and the experiences of their hearers. Rather than assuming common human experience or the interchangeability of human experiences, says McClure, preachers must engage in what he calls sustained embodied movement toward the experiences of others at every level of homiletics. Second, Charles Campbell critiques the new homiletic and narrative homiletics, especially the work of Charles Rice, Fred Craddock, Edmund Steamley, and Eugene Lowry. According to Campbell, while narrative homiletics has offered important contributions to the field of homiletics, it has lacked serious theological reflection and has not resulted in a more vital and faithful church, as the decline of mainline Protestantism attests. Campbell repudiates the idea of evoking an experiential event for hearers of the sermon. He argues that God in Jesus Christ should be the focus of sermons, not human experience, and that preaching should build up the church instead of catering to individuals. Additionally, Campbell says that while contemporary narrative homiletics has been concerned with formal matters of plot, the key to the Gospels is not their narrative form, but the character of Jesus, which their narrative form reveals. Parables must be placed back inside the narrative context of the Gospels and must not be separated from the identity of their teller. Jesus, says Campbell, should not be seen as the model preacher as much as he should be seen as the one who is preached. Third, James W. Thompson argues that the new homiletic is insufficient in an increasingly post-Christian culture that characterizes modern-day North America. He says the new homiletic works best when listeners are familiar with Christian tradition and are biblically literate. Yet these things can no longer be assumed today. It also permits individuals to draw their own conclusion to the sermon, which does not facilitate the formation of Christian community. Furthermore, says Thompson, the new homiletic focuses so much on narrative that it ignores the revelatory potential of other biblical genres of discourse. It is also hesitant to speak authoritatively in order to demand specific changes in the lives of listeners, which is sometimes necessary, pastorally and theologically. Fourth, Henry Mitchell offers an implicit critique of the new homiletic. He suggests that the new hermeneutic on which the new homiletic is based is not new to black hermeneutics. For Mitchell, quoting Gerhard Ebeling and the new hermeneutic school is simply a way to legitimize in the minds of white theologians what black preachers have been doing for centuries. Mitchell states, the black hermeneutic is actually a better example of this new hermeneutic than is likely to be found generally in the preaching traditions of modern Europe or America in the white churches. If the chief task of hermeneutics is to convey the revelation in its contemporary context, then black hermeneutics far outstrip this school, which most blacks never heard of anyway. And Mitchell argues rather forcefully that black preachers of old exemplified the new hermeneutic long before the Germans spelled it out. Just as black hermeneutics embodied the new hermeneutic before it was articulated by European theologians, black preachers represented the new homiletic before it was elucidated by white homileticians. For example, while Craddock's purely inductive approach is rather distinctive, the primacy of images over concepts and the use of anticipation and suspense had been central to black homiletics for centuries before Craddock wrote as one without authority. Additionally, designing a sermon in the form of a plot had been prominent in African American preaching for centuries before Lowry published the homiletical plot. Although Lowry and Craddock offer distinctive proposals, many of their grand themes were already known, loved, and practiced by African American preachers. My point is this: although rarely acknowledged as such, the new homiletic was largely a white mainline movement. It promoted homiletic theory and practice that black preachers had used for centuries, but did so under the auspices of European theologians. Craddock and Lowry and company did not need to look to theologians across the sea for these insights. They could have looked to preachers across the tracks. In many ways, black homiletics exemplified the new homiletic before the new homiletic was a thing, especially in the areas of narrative design, the use of anticipation, the value of images over concepts, and the important idea of creating an experiential encounter for the listeners. Mitchell is sometimes identified as one of the key homileticians within the new homiletic. But his whole point is that the key themes of the new homiletic are actually quite old. Mitchell's work suggests that the new homiletic is not just getting old of late, but rather that in a way it's always been old.